Hey YouTube, welcome back to my channel, Taylor Talks Tales. Today I'm going to be doing a video. It's what I read in the month of March. Starting now and going forward, I'm going to be doing this type of video once a month, just summarizing what I read in the previous month. Just because I think it's nice, you guys can sort of see what I've been reading and give you some more mini recommendations, that kind of thing. I also want to point out that I recently moved bedrooms. Over the weekend I moved into a new room, so I'm experimenting with the lighting, and I'm also experimenting with my bookshelves. I went from having 3 bookshelves to 2 because one of them was built in, so that's why it looks a little cluttered right now. I'm playing around with it. And I also have a fun video coming up in the next few days because I'm celebrating hitting over 300 subscribers, so thank you so much for subscribing and supporting this channel. I really appreciate it, and I just love all of you guys so much. So let's get into the video before this gets too long. I read 14 books in the month of March. I'm going to show you 12 and talk about 12 today because 2 of them are part of the Dresden Files series, and I'm not going to talk about them until I do the big overview of the Dresden Files series, which will be coming up sometime in mid to late March, or April. Can't believe we're in April. So these are the 12 books I read, and I'm going to just do a very brief synopsis, very brief description and kind of what my thoughts were on it and their final rating. And I'm doing this in order from my least favorite of the month to my most favorite of the month. So here we go. So I read The Dead Girls Club by Damien Angelica Waters, and this one was my least favorite of the month. I ended up giving it, I believe, a 2.5 out of 5 stars. And because I actually had a pretty decent reading month in March. Most of the books I read were 4 or 5 stars, which is awesome. So this one is about female friendship. It's about this woman named Heather who she works with troubled youth and in the present, and she gets mailed this like half of a locket necklace, one of those like BFF necklaces, and somebody knows that she killed her childhood best friend. And it sounds really awesome. And I think this book, if it had done different things and gone down a different pathway, would have been better for me. It's told in a then and now perspective, like in dual timelines, and that could have been cool, except for I hated the now timeline. Heather now is just a mess. There's just so much going on, and she just did weird things. I just didn't like her as a character. The then aspect was pretty neat. I enjoyed the mythology of this red lady that the girls were all obsessed with, because this does have to do with essentially these like middle schoolers becoming friends, and they tell each other scary stories, and they get really into this one story about the red lady. It sounds super awesome, but the execution of this wasn't what I wanted. I either wanted it to have, I wanted more from it. So 2.5 out of 5 stars. A little bit of a disappointing read, even though the cover is gorgeous and the concept sounds really cool, but just wasn't for me. Next one I read was The Chestnut Man by Soren Civilstrup, and I apologize for butchering that name. This book, I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5 star. I know this is very much loved on BookTube and on Goodreads, but I think for me, it missed the mark a little bit, and it could have just been I wasn't quite in the mood for it. When I read this book, so essentially this book is about this serial killer who leaves chestnut men that they make and leave at the crime scene of bodies, and about these 2 cops who are trying to, or detectives who are trying to solve the case. And from the description, inside flap, and what people have been telling me, I thought this was going to be a thriller. And this is more of a police procedural. It's more of a mystery. And I do like police procedurals and mysteries, but I think going into this, I was expecting it to be gorier. I was expecting it to be more intense and more like a thriller. And because it wasn't, and the pacing was a little slow for me at times, I think this was probably just a case of it was me, not the book. So you should still probably go check it out because it was decently written. But I just gave it a 3 out of 5 stars just because I had to kind of push myself to finish it, and I was just not in the mood. Next one was The Grace Year by Kim Liggett. I gave this a 3.75 out of 5. Almost a 4-star book. I really enjoyed it a lot. Essentially, it's about young women in... I've heard several interpretations of this. This is either a strange alternative past or a strange alternative future here, or it could be it's totally set in a different world. It's kind of up to interpretation. And women in their girls in their 16th year essentially are releasing this magic. They all believe that these women have magic powers and they have to get the magic out. And it's a very patriarchal society, to the point where women and girls are branded with their father's brand, and it's pretty intense. And overall, I enjoyed it. I gave 3.75 out of 5 just because I've read a lot of dystopian and I felt like there were certain elements of it that I'd already read before. But at the same time, it did bring a lot of new, fresh ideas to it as well. And it was like, the girls do go pretty crazy and there's a lot of descriptions and there's just a lot of stuff that I did enjoy about this. There was just something missing for me a little bit, which is why I gave 3.75 out of 5. But, you know, it's still worth checking out. Next one is Within These Walls by Anya Alborn. So this one I gave a 4 out of 5 star, although I've been flip-flopping about maybe reducing it a little bit, just because it's not nearly as good as her other books. So I've only read 2 of her books. I loved Brother, and The Devil Crept In was also very enjoyable for me. This one was not quite up to par with those 2, even though this has to do with cults. And I pretty much enjoy anything that has to do with weird cults or just strange thought processes and how people get sucked into, you know, people's beliefs and everything. So this one, essentially, it follows a writer who gets contacted by the leader of this cult. So this is also told in a dual timeline, and this cult leader's been in jail for decades at this point, and the cult leader says, you can write my story and I'll give you all this insider information. You have to live in my house. And there's like some other weird things, but the writer, the true crime writer, he's so desperate because he's running out of money, his wife's cheating on him and is going to leave him, and he's had a strained relationship with his daughter. So he does it. So he packs up and he brings his 12-year-old daughter with him, and they go to Washington State and are trying to, you know, tell the story of this guy. And it was pretty good. I think I enjoyed the past timeline more than the future timeline, because I think both the writer and his daughter are a little unlikable at times, which is fine, but it just, I felt like the scares weren't, it wasn't as intense of a book as The Devil Crept In or Brother, and so for me, I found myself almost wanting to kind of flip through pages and get through it a little bit quicker, but I enjoyed it. So that's why I'm like flip-flopping between like a 3.75 and a 4, because the atmosphere was very good. And it is very well written. Anya Alborn does know how to write, so check it out. Next one is Be Not Far From Me by Mindy McGinnis. I did a review of this on my channel when I did the 3 on a theme, so I'm only going to briefly talk about this, and this essentially is a young adult survival novel, and it's following a girl named Ashley, and she has to essentially make it back to civilization after a drunken accident. And I gave it 4 out of 5 star. Yeah, I gave it 4 out of 5 star. Very solid book. Not as good as I'm Still Alive, and I think it could have been a little bit longer, and you know, a few things could have been changed, but it was still really enjoyable. So if you like YA survival, this is a good one to check out. Next one is Jack Ketchum. Off Season by Jack Ketchum. So this is Jack Ketchum's first book he ever wrote, and I wanted to give it a shot because I've read a few other of his books and really enjoyed them all quite a bit. And this one essentially is following a cannibalist family versus a writer and her friends who are coming up to visit for the weekend. And it's gory and very graphic. When this was released, there were a lot of complaints about this book, and I know that there was a version of this book going around that was more edited and a lot of those extreme scenes taken out. I'm glad that I got my hands on this copy because it's a very enjoyable, fun read. Is it, you know, anything fancy? No. Is it sort of a, you know, basic, enjoyable horror novel? Yes. So it's, you know, very descriptive, and Jack Ketchum knows how to keep you hooked into the book. So I gave this 4 out of 5 stars just because it's, you know, I think it's being his first book, there were a few things that are a little off about it, but I still had a lot of fun reading it, and I recommend it, especially if you're looking for a cannibalist horror or survival horror or just something fun. Now we're getting into the 4.5 out of 5 stars. So I already did a review on this Hunter Shea creature. 4.5 out of 5 stars. This was a very good book. Brought a lot of heart to this situation, and it was a really eye-opening experience for me reading about a character with chronic, like severe chronic pain. Essentially it's following this couple. The wife has horrible chronic pain, and they decide that they want to get away for a few months and rent a cabin up, I believe in Maine, and there seems to be something following them, potentially haunting them, and they aren't sure what. And this was just a very enjoyable book. I only knocked half a star off of it because it was a little slow at parts, but it's very character driven and just a very heartwarming story, and I highly recommend it. Okay, these 2 books I'm only going to briefly talk about because they are sequels, so there's not really much for me to say. But this is Before They Are Hanged by Joe Abercrombie. This is the 2nd book in the First Law trilogy. And then this is a short story collection, Sharp Ends, that also takes place in that universe. And both of these I gave 5 out of 5 stars. They were very enjoyable. I really wish I could get my hands on the 3rd book, but Amazon won't be shipping that book to me until the end of April, which makes sense. I want them to be able to send stuff to people in need. I don't need a book right now, but and I could check it out on my Kindle, but I much prefer just reading things in print. But both these are very good. Highly recommend the series. I'm really looking forward to the 3rd book, and I actually think that Before They Were Hanged, I think I enjoyed it even more than the 1st book. I liked the 1st book, but I think this book is a more solid story. Like, I liked the story better in this one. Alright, just a couple more and then we're done. So, next book, My Dark Vanessa. In this book, I think it's going to be one of those books you're going to want to talk about in book club or with your friends or something, because this book has a lot to say, and it's very, I would say, at times controversial. I enjoyed this book. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I had to think about it though, and I do think one of the more common complaints was that it seemed a little repetitive and it could have been shortened, and it could have been, but I also really enjoyed Kate Elizabeth Russell, the author's writing style, and the story enough that it didn't bother me that it was a little repetitive at times. It's just, the sense of place in this is very strong, like you could really picture this boarding school, but essentially the story is about a 15-year-old, well, it's also a dual perspective, or dual timeline book. In one timeline, there's this 15-year-old Vanessa, and she essentially is groomed and assaulted many, many times by her teacher, who is her literature professor, Jacob Strain. And then it's told 17 years later when she's 32 and seems to be a bit messed up by the situation, but conflicted. Because the thing about this book is it really makes you think about just consent, and it makes you think about abuse and sexual abuse and a lot. And especially with Vanessa, because when you read it from her 15-year-old perspective, she seemed to be in love with Jacob Strain, her professor, even though their situation was absolutely not okay. And when you read this, there are a lot of scenes with statutory rape in it. So just know going into this book, if that's a trigger for you, this is like, I swear, half the book. So you may want to avoid it, but it just, yeah, it's very complicated, and I want to do a full-fledged book review on this because it was very good. So 5 out of 5 star. Alright, next one. I was so excited to read this book, and I enjoyed the heck out of it, and that is Kill Creek by Scott Thomas. And this was a 5 out of 5 star read for me. I loved it. It is entertaining. It's written by a horror fan for horror fans. Essentially, there are these 4 authors who go spend the night at this haunted house for like this online internet TV show done by this like wealthy YouTuber guy, basically. And it goes from there. And I loved this book because the authors each felt so distinct to me, but there were also like elements of different authors like you could pull from. Like Stephen King and H.P. Lovecraft was like one author I felt like he seemed to be really inspired by that, and then there's like one author who was sort of supposed to be like a Christopher Pike and like R.L. Stine mixed with something else, and it was just so much fun. And it took I wasn't sure what to expect with this book because it sounds almost like your traditional haunted house story, but it's not. It brings some refreshing elements to it. I liked it a lot, and there are like some fun theories that you can talk about too, because there's a few things that are left sort of up to interpretation, which I really liked. And of course the ending I thought was, I don't want to spoil anything, so I'm not going to say it, but there's a certain type of ending I really like in horror novels, and it does it, so I enjoyed this a lot. I'm going to do a full-fledged book review on this, so stay tuned for that, but 5 out of 5 stars. Definitely check it out, especially if you're a horror fan. This is a lot of fun. Alright, and the last one is In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. This book destroyed me in a good way. So this book is very short, and it essentially follows our author. This is a memoir, and it follows her abusive relationship with this woman that she dated years before, and it's just told in such a fantastic, fascinating way. Like basically it'll be like Dream House as Meet the Parents, Dream House as Here Comes the Bride. Each chapter is told in a different style, and it comes together so neatly. And this is also a book I want to do a full-fledged book review on because I had a lot of thoughts and feelings about it, but it's a solid 5 out of 5 star read for me. It's very emotional, and it brings in like abuse in the LGBTQ community. It shows that women can also be abusers, and that's something that people don't really like to bring up, but I think it's very important. Like Carmen went through some severe abuse, especially like the emotional and psychological kind, which I think can be just as sinister, if not more sinister than physical, because physical is terrible and you could die, but with emotional and psychological abuse, that's the kind of stuff that really sticks with you forever if you don't go seek therapy. And yeah, so it's very heartbreaking, and it also just details sort of unhealthy relationships, and I don't know what it was about this book, but I just really connected with it a lot. And I don't want to spoil too much. I think it's good to just go in and enjoy the story for itself, but I recommend it for anybody who wants to pick up it's not an easy book, sort of like with my Dark Vanessa. They aren't like sit down and be like, oh, this is a lighthearted fun book. It's an emotional read, but if you're up for it, I highly recommend it. Alright, so those are the books that I read in the month of March, and in a couple days I'll be releasing my April TBR, even though I already have a couple books completed off of that TBR, but that's okay. So, what are you guys reading for April, and what did you read for March? What was your favorite book of March? So, stay tuned for some fun videos coming up, and thank you all so much for the support. I really appreciate it, and like, comment, rate, subscribe, stay healthy, and happy reading! Bye.